Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce Steve Wiseman. He is a lecturer at Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, formerly in the School of Law at UC Berkeley. And like many of our technical faculty, he spent many years in industry, uh, working especially in the Public Utilities Commission in various roles, including as a judge. So he brought tons of experience back into the classroom in his later career. Uh, he is going to be speaking about a very broad topic that many of us don't always think about. We talked about it in our opening yesterday, that the third leg of that um, key elements being public policy, and it's very challenging. And with that, um, Steve, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. I think Peter's right. I've been actually in the energy policy world for a long time now, and I did spend a lot of that time working in state government, but I've just been exclusively teaching now for almost 20 years. And the world of public policy is complicated. It's bumpy. It has cycles to it, and we seem to be on the verge potentially of heading into a new cycle with the change of administrations in Washington. But I think there's no denying that the ability to move forward in the world of energy efficiency, in the world of renewables, and in terms of dealing with climate is so very much dependent on how the world that these industries function in, how that world is framed through public policy. So what I'd like to invite you to do for the next few minutes is sit back with me and kind of consider just the notion of what this thing called public policy is, why we should care about it, and what some of the challenges and pitfalls and opportunities are as we move forward. Let me start with this notion. If you think about our relationship to the universe, for thousands and thousands of years, human beings have looked at the sky and tried to figure out what the heck is going on up there. It turns out that there's a fundamental human nature, element of human nature, which is to really try to simplify things, try to take complex things and reduce them to simple notions. And certainly our relationship to the universe has been like that historically. Trying to make sense out of this infinite sky with points of light. Human beings for thousands of years have looked for patterns and decided that there are these things that we now call constellations, and they give us really a way to feel at home in the broadness of the universe. And what we get out of that, of course, is the ability to create stories about what's happening in the sky. We can find a bear in what we now call the Big Dipper, and that can give us some sense of comfort and an ability to find a place in the universe. But what it doesn't really do is fundamentally help us understand the functioning of the universe and all the complexity that's within it. And it's been really only in recent generations that we've been starting to try to figure that out in any kind of a meaningful way. Well, this is not a direct criticism. It's really an observation of human nature, because it can't be a criticism, because obviously if we spent all of our time trying to contemplate the vastness of the universe, we're not going to get anywhere. The challenge with public policy is that same element of human nature is at play, and we have a tendency to try to simplify things and regretfully overly simplify them in many instances. And that means that we have public debates about policy, and then we have policy enactments that really don't produce the results that people might hope they would, because of the fact that we haven't considered the nuance and the detail that's so important to having those policies be effective. And now to be able to talk about this, let me try to step back and let's talk about fundamentally again about what the nature of this thing is that we call public policy. Let's first think about the context in which we're looking at this. We have very much of a divided world right now, even within the United States, and it really has arguably two major phenomena that are causing these divisions. One is just the political tribalism that we're all familiar with right now. The fact that that we seem to be so closely divided as a nation into extreme thoughts about the left or extreme thoughts about the right, and public discourse that tends to try to pull people in one of those directions or the other. At the same time, we also have fairly significant jurisdictional boundaries between the federal government and states, between the individual states, with cities and counties within these states, and the reason we've got a challenge now in terms of public policy is the way these two kinds of divided worlds function together in a way that makes things perhaps even more challenging. Think, for instance, about the fact that right now, a state like California, where I live, has a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature with a supermajority, so that that it actually could be possible for the legislature to undertake emergency actions and to potentially even override a veto from the governor if it had to. So entirely Democratic. And then you look on the federal level, and you've got within a handful of days, we're going to be in a situation where all the legislative and executive portions of the federal government are going to be within the control of one party, which is the Republicans. And then you also, of course, have a Supreme Court that is heavily packed at this point with conservative Republican appointees. And so you've got a very different kind of jurisdictional challenge. You've got the political divide reflected in the relationship between this state and some of the other blue-leaning states and the federal government. So making good policy in that context is very challenging. So what is this environment? What are the kind of directions you can go with public policy? In a minute, I want to actually step back, even just talk about how we define what public policy is. But let's talk at this point here about where we can collectively take action and what it could look like in terms of trying to affect things like, let's say, the market for a more efficient appliance, for instance. Well, there are basically two extremes. You could decide, well, we're just going to sit back and watch what the marketplace does, and we'll let people decide on their own whether, for instance, they want to go with a more efficient appliance or less efficient one. Or in the other end of the spectrum, you say, well, we're going to have government do this itself. And there's some types of things where we do have government just do it. I mean, for instance, we have government provide, in most instances, provide fire protection and mosquito abatement and other things that we think are very important. And we don't want to leave these outcomes just to the functioning of the private marketplace. So those might be the two poles, but in between the poles, there's room for a whole lot of variation. And let's think about what that might look like. So if on the left end of the spectrum, you're saying, well, we're just going to let the market do things. We'll sit back and hope that people make good decisions. And on the right, again, you've got government just undertaking an activity itself and saying, well, we're not going to worry about what individual people will do. We're just going to do it collectively. Well, along that spectrum, you have what arguably would be a greater or lesser amount of government interference with what markets might normally do. So if you move from A to B, you'd say, well, there are things we can do to try, we'll let people make their own market decisions, but we're going to try to do things to kind of put a thumb on the scale a little bit. We're going to try to do things to encourage people to make the right kinds of decisions. So we can do things that, for instance, might make the price of what we think a bad outcome would be to be more expensive than the price of doing the good outcome. Or we can decide we're going to try to stimulate the market. Maybe we'll provide a tax break or a rebate to people who want to to do what we think is the good thing. But again, here we're allowing people to make individual market decisions, but we're doing it in a way that we hope is going to kind of tilt in the direction that we're interested in pursuing. And then you've got this moving again farther to the right. Well, we can do things that actually limit the decisions that you can make. We can, for instance, ban things that we think are bad, and so we did that to a large extent. For instance, with light bulbs, and decided that we want to require a certain level of efficiency in light bulbs. And what this did, in effect, was to kind of move the classic incandescent light bulb largely out of many of the markets. And so you could still buy anything else that might be available, but we're going to say certain things should not be allowed. Or you can have a generalized kind of a mandate. You could do things like saying, as California wants to say, we're going to require that if you buy a vehicle in state as of 2035, it's going to have to be one that does not rely on an internal combustion engine. So you still could, do what you want within that range. That's a general mandate, but you can have, or you can have a specific one. Let's say going forward, if you want to be able to heat your home, you're going to have to get an electric heat pump instead of relying on a gas furnace. That could be a specific kind of mandate, or you need to have low flow shower heads in a new home, or when you sell your home, you have to make sure there's ceiling insulation. Those kinds of specific mandates can also be applied as well. And so there is a full range of things that can be done. And if you think about individual kinds of policies, you can see how some of them fit in one of these categories and some fit in another. So where does genius lie in all this? It's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the politics. So what is public policy? I think people generally have two ways of thinking about it. One is to see a series of actions that have been taken by government or could be taken by government, and see what they tend to, what kind of a world they tend to create. And you say, well, the policies are defined by a series of actions. Or you could say that you can look at it in reverse and say, well, policy is a matter of developing a series of principles, things that are going to be guiding lights for the laws you create, or the regulations, or the individual actions you're going to take later. And I think that arguably both these ways of looking at the policy world are correct. In some instances, we can identify a policy based on our actions, and sometimes we can shape our actions to fit what we agreed in advance is an objective we want to achieve through public policy. So what are the ways that we do this? Well, we obviously can do it through legislation at the state level and federal level, or cities and counties can have their own ordinances. You can create policies by saying this is what we tend to accomplish, and we could talk about specifics in that if we have the time. We do it through regulation. Sometimes all you're doing in regulation is, well, you're always trying to implement your mandate under legislation, but while you're doing that, you can wind up, in effect, creating new policy directions. I think that recently the Federal Communications Commission, for instance, decided that we should no longer think about social media or the internet as being something other than a communication system, and we regulate communication systems, so we're going to insist on there being a neutral way of handling the internet. That was an effort to create policy through regulation. Court stepped in and said, no, we think you've gone too far, and they pushed back against that approach. Court decisions can not only affect the way that the government can create and implement policies. It can define policies. I mean, think, for instance, about Roe versus Wade, which said, well, within the shadows of different elements of the U.S. Constitution, we find a right to privacy, and we're going to therefore declare that women have the right to make a decision about their own bodies within certain limitations. And so that established a policy over 50 years ago. And then the current Supreme Court change that policy. They didn't like abortion, and so they moved back from that. Or think about the relatively recent actions by the Supreme Court to honor same-sex marriages and in a way that wasn't reflected in federal or most state legislation, but they found that it seemed to be an appropriate policy based on how they read the Constitution. And there, in a state like California and many other states, you can have people voting on referendum or ballot measures that are going to declare a particular policy or declare a way of implementing one. And also, I think arguably private actions can have an effect. Think, for instance, of the internet service companies that want to have large server hotels and want to have a tremendous amount of electricity to serve those hotels, and they want to do it in a clean way. And so there's now an initiative on the part of some corporations to create their own modular nuclear plants, for instance, in order to change the kind of mix they'll have available for their own energy needs. So you have all of these different ways of doing things. Well, how do you determine a policy? What I'm going to say here may seem self-evident, but I think it's worth going over for a minute anyway. I think the first thing you want to do is understand what the world should look like, what do you want the results to be in terms of what's going to function. Let's say you're worried about people's mobility, the ability to get from one place to another, and so you say, all right, well, how are we going to achieve those goals? Well, what's the problem right now? Well, the problem is that a lot of people don't have cars, and those people aren't going to have cars. And so they're going to need to have some other way to get around. So we got to find a way to clear that barrier out of the way. Well, what are the tools we have available? We could have a car lending system. We could try to put in more bike lanes. We could have a better mass transit system. We can have Waymo driverless taxis. And so you identify these tools and you try to work with those tools to try to figure out how you could craft a solution to this problem that may help you get closer to achieving your goals. That's what it's all about. And again, this may seem self-evident, but the reality is in most of the situations that I've observed over the years, we don't go through those steps. What we tend to do is we start with solutions. We say, well, what's the problem we have? Well, the problem is that we don't have enough bike lanes. And so the solution is we need to get bike lanes. And, to some extent, that may be a comfortable way to go for a lot of people, but here's the challenge. If you don't identify what it is you're trying to achieve, you don't look at the range of options for getting there, you're maybe cheating yourself and you may be pursuing a result that won't get you where you need to go or won't do it very efficiently. So the policy analysis process involves bringing science and discipline to bear in each of these steps in terms of identifying the goals, the barriers, et cetera. There are lots of tools that are available to do it, and that's partially what gives me a job teaching in a policy school, because we have to understand how to work with these tools to be able to go through this level of analysis. So that's the way I see the pathway for public policy, and we could probably dwell on this the rest of the time we have, but I want to move on from there to talk about some of the other challenges that help keep us in a divided world when perhaps we don't want to be in one. One is, of course, the split between state and federal jurisdictions. In the energy world, it turns out that historically, most of the decisions are being made at the local level or at the state level. Think, for instance, about the development of coal or oil and gas. These are things that were based on what's in the ground. The decisions were being made locally or in the state level about what kind of extraction should be allowed, how these things should be priced, et cetera. And the federal government really only got involved when it became clear that there was some type of a federal interest in this. And I'll go over that federal interest shortly. But so how do these state and federal things interact? Well, again, forgive me for going over fundamentals, but I think it's important to remember that on the federal level, you've got a constitution. And that constitution identifies certain specific powers the federal government has. Federal government can't do anything that isn't a power given to it through the Constitution. Everything else goes to the states or to the people. So anything that the federal government wants to do in the form of passing laws or rules and regulations, everything has to be consistent with the Constitution. And so the rules and regulations themselves not only have to be consistent with the Constitution, they have to be consistent with the statutes. And so you see this interplay. The courts are involved in it, trying to figure out whether something's constitutional, figure out whether it's defined specifically in a statute or not, and what to do about that. The Constitution, again, the provisions of the Constitution allow for things to be done through statutory law, through regulations that are created by agencies, but also through this thing called common law, which is where the courts come up with equitable solutions to things, even if there's no particular statute that covers it. So this is all done within the protections of what the Constitution would allow. But then you have states. In a federal system, you have states. And so then this picture gets more complex. You have not only the federal government with its constitution, you've got state level constitutions, and everything in the state constitution has to be consistent with what's in the federal constitution. It can go farther in terms of creating new rights and privileges, but it can't do anything in a way that denies things that are already established in the federal constitution. And in the states, the statutes also have to be consistent with both constitutions, with rules and regulations have to be consistent with those statutes. And so you have all these different layers that are going to have a big impact on what can be done on these various levels of government and what that looks like. So again, the federal government can get involved when it finds a particular federal interest. And these are sort of probably the main ways that might arguably have an impact on energy and the energy world. First, of course, is the notion of interstate commerce. Congress can regulate commerce between the states. By implications, the courts say the states cannot do that. So if anything could touch upon interstate commerce, then the federal government can control that. It has all of total say on what happens in a way that crosses the borders of the United States. So think, for instance, about the Keystone XL pipeline, which was designed to bring tar sands-based oil from Alberta down through the United States to Texas to be refined. And there was a debate about whether it was a good thing to do in a world where we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to take this heavy polluting oil and to increase the amount of oil being brought into the United States that way. The Obama administration said, no, we're not going to allow this pipeline because it's a bad thing to do. Trump came in and said, yes, we are going to allow this pipeline. A Biden administration said, no, we're not going to allow this pipeline. And so this kind of debate over international borders and what crosses those borders can have an impact on energy as well. Federal government can regulate anything dealing with navigable waters, which means, among other things, that it decides where there can be hydroelectric plants and implements those programs. It also has taken on a role related to nuclear safety, largely because of the fact that the U.S. devised nuclear weapons and then wanted to find a way to safely use that technology for everybody's benefit. And arguably because climate knows no borders, no boundaries, ultimately the federal government could be the major player in climate policy as well. Although, as we know, it has elected largely in many instances not to do that. I've talked about this notion of simplicity and how I believe it can have the tendency to try to oversimplify things can create challenges in terms of having effective public policy. So for instance, let's take 4 quick examples. In terms of climate, California has a cap and trade program. We sort of limit on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. that can be released in any given year. And then the entities have to comply with that. Can only release greenhouse gases if they have an allowance that allows them to do that. And so it sounds like a great program. Over the course of time, you push the cap farther down, and that way you reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. But when the cap and trade program was created in California, it was within the reality of the current political system. And so what they wound up doing was, for instance, saying, well, we're going to create a bunch of other things along with this cap and trade program. One is we're going to say you can avoid needing an allowance if you can go out and buy an offset somewhere. What's an offset? Well, you can give money to somebody else for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And then you can take credit for the fact that they reduce their emissions, and that allows you to continue to pollute. One of the big ones that was allowed in California involves forest offsets. And the main thing there is making sure somebody won't cut down trees. And so you pay them money not to cut down their trees or to plant more trees. And then the question is, though, is this really producing a meaningful result? Number one, do we know they would have cut the trees down otherwise? And number two, what do you do about the fact that even if somebody agrees they're going to keep a certain number of trees available, which is great because trees absorb greenhouse gas emissions, that's not stopping the fact that people are still going to want to buy trees. They're going to want to buy lumber. And so they're just going to go somewhere else potentially to get that lumber. And so maybe the overall amount of lumber that's going to be trees that'll be cut down isn't going to change. And so it's just really an effective program. And they also did things like saying, well, you could bank allowances. You could buy allowances now, and if you don't need them, you can hang on to them until later, and then you can use them then. And then the question is, of course, is this going to, in effect, assure that later on, when it gets harder to reduce emissions, that people just aren't going to reduce emissions because they banked all these allowances. The renewable portfolio standards, the majority of states in the US have a renewable portfolio standard, which, as you may know, means that the utilities within those jurisdictions have an obligation to ensure that a certain amount of the power they put in the grid comes from renewable sources. Sounds great, and it is great, and it's moving us into a position where we can rely to a lesser extent on fossil fuel to deliver power. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, in most instances, the laws that require the use of renewables are not specific about when those kilowatt hours of renewable power are generated. They're just requiring that a certain amount of the annual electricity must come from renewable sources. So what have we got? Well, the result is we have a tremendous reliance on wind and on solar, which are fantastic. They're low-cost renewable sources, but they're also intermittent. They only work when the wind blows and the sun shines. And so what's the result of that? Well, there's still a strong argument for continuing to have fossil fuel power plants so that we can ensure that people have power whenever they need it. Well, there's now more of a tendency to talk about what people refer to as 24/7 renewables, understanding that it's really important if we're going to get to 100% renewables or 100% clean energy over time, we're going to have to find a way to match up the generation with the time when we need it. And now one way to do that, of course, is to generate with solar and wind and use some of that excess just to charge batteries. And they have the batteries available to provide power at times when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. Or you could use those assets to produce hydrogen and use the hydrogen as a clean fuel at a later time. These are all options, but at this point, they're being retrofit on top of an ongoing policy area and creating a need for greater expense, arguably, than we would have needed if people had looked from the outset at the need to make those renewables fit the pattern of usage. Natural gas, I think, is another really significant area here. A number of years ago, people declared, well, natural gas will be a great bridge fuel. This will help us reduce our reliance on coal and get us to a point where we'll be ready for clean power usage, for clean energy usage. But of course, in declaring that there's going to be a bridge, nobody talked about how long the bridge was going to be or how we're going to get off of that bridge. In effect, what we've done is we failed to plan for our use of natural gas. We've also failed to recognize the fact that even though when you look at what comes out of a smokestack, for instance, at a natural gas power plant, you could say, well, the emissions coming from that are significantly less than the emissions you'd get from a coal plant. That's great. But what people weren't doing is looking at the downstream and the upstream, the upstream sources of potential pollution. Methane is, as you know, the major ingredient in natural gas. And methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. And we weren't bothering initially to look at the fact that there's a tremendous amount of leakage that occurs at the wellheads when you're developing the natural gas, and in the pipelines and the processing centers. And then to a very significant extent at the end use, we weren't recognizing, for instance, the fact that there's a tremendous amount of indoor pollution in homes and that comes from the use of natural gas in homes. And so, this failure to get beyond the simple notion of just relying on what seems to be a cleaner fuel has really set us back in terms of our overall goals. And I think that also arguably this has been the case with energy efficiency as well. I mean, think about the way we've tried to identify what a beneficial result is if you're going to achieve a certain amount of reduction in usage of any kind of energy source based on an energy efficiency strategy. What are you actually accomplishing, and are you doing the best thing possible? So what we did is we spent tens or hundreds of millions of dollars initially on encouraging people to use compact fluorescent light bulbs. And now we've moved people significantly away from those. We've not tended to probably undercount a lot of times the extent to which people would have adopted these more efficient things even without the incentive programs. So we've overvalued the results of these programs. And there's hardly anything more important than becoming more efficient in our energy use. So the question is whether we're doing this in a way that's the most effective use of our funds. And I think there have been a lot of questions that have come up over energy efficiency expenditures for those reasons as well. So looking again, first at looking again briefly at the RPS programs, the Renewable Portfolio Standards, we can see what the results have been in the early years. And you can see in this pie chart for cumulative electric capacity additions using various fuel sources, almost 2/3 of the capacity is wind, and 30% is solar. So you've got over 90% of the installed capacity is intermittent, which is creating the challenges that I'm mentioning in terms of the overall ability to actually serve customers when they want power with clean power. Natural gas, we talked about planning, we talked about smokestack thinking, this notion that all you have to do is pay attention to what's coming out of the smokestack and you know whether you're doing something beneficial or not. Of course, there's also a big push, especially by the natural gas industry, to now argue that you can make natural gas renewable by using solid waste methane, produced methane, and dairy waste, et cetera. And of course, the question is whether you can really rely on that pathway to get you to what eventually has to be 100% reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And I think the answer to that is probably no. Energy efficiency, probably one of the biggest points here is that we've spent a phenomenal amount of money on the utility energy efficiency programs and continue to do so. Here's a results that came out from the Lawrence Berkeley Lab earlier this week. You can see that according to their estimate, the vast majority of the reductions in energy use have come not from those utility programs, but from federal appliance standards and also from state-based appliance standards in places like California. So again, the notion that we're going to accomplish these reductions with utility programs is probably, well, at a minimum, significantly overstating the impact we're likely to have with those programs. So what could potentially look a little better? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by Congress a couple years ago, has a fairly complex system, for instance, of tax credits. You've been able to get tax credits for installing solar or wind, for instance, for quite a long time. But what they've done now is they've recognized that this isn't a simple world where you just look for any installed solar and any installed wind, and you're going to be accomplishing all of your public policy goals, and recognizing there are other things we care about too, like increasing domestic production, and for some people, supporting prevailing wages that you'd pay to unionized employees, and creating job training programs and doing other things that are going to be supporting society within the United States on a broader level. And so now they've created more complexity in these tax credits and said, well, you're going to get a certain level of tax credit. If you just put in solar, you'll get more. If it's uses domestic materials, et cetera, et cetera. So they made it more complex, and people criticize that because of the complexity. But the reality is, I think it's a reflection of the fact that, in fact, when we do things, we're having broad impact, not just on the initial objective of getting, for instance, more solar or wind. You're also affecting other things, and need to take those into account in setting up effective policy. So I'm not going to talk more about those then. I want to take the last few minutes to just sort of reflect a little bit on how we might, in this world, make things a little better. First, again, as I mentioned before, start by talking about what your objectives are, not start talking about what the right solution ought to be. Get to the solution by going through this process on a step-by-step basis. Remember, I got asked to go down to Mexico a number of years ago by CFE, which is the utility that provides most of the electric service within Mexico. They want to build a new hydroelectric dam. The problem is they had to go through indigenous communities in order to do that, and those communities could veto the project. And the question that we were being asked to help them with was, how can we convince the indigenous communities to support this new hydro plant? What I said to them was, stop talking about a hydro plant and start talking about what it is you really need. If we're talking about, for instance, having universal access to electricity or meeting load growth, et cetera, talk about that and understand that problem together, and then talk about what's getting in the way of doing that and what your options are for trying to solve the problem. Bring people along in the conversation rather than starting with the solution. I'm not sure they listened to me, but that was my advice. What else? Well, rely on life cycle analysis is probably another very significant thing to say. If we're going to say, well, natural gas is going to be better than coal, then look at all of the implications of using something like natural gas in order to realize whether, in fact, you're going to produce the result you say you want to produce. This is a big one for me. I worked at a regulatory agency for a long time. Regulate without shame. What does that mean? What I think that means is not stepping so far to the left side of that spectrum I showed you, where you're saying, well, we're going to have light touch regulation and hope that especially these investor-owned utilities, that they're going to have the motivation to do the right thing. That's not why we have regulation. We have regulation to ensure that the right thing happens, and be happy to talk to you in more detail about what I think that means. Also, it's important to recognize that if we have multiple policies, they're going to have effects on each other. If we're going to, if you want to accomplish different goals at the same time, then understand how these things work together, or understand how the companies that you're asking to implement them are going to try to make them work together or not. We tend to look at policies in isolation, and I think that's a big mistake. I think it's going to be important to, especially as we're pursuing climate goals, to stop just hoping that the markets are going to take care of this and do it the way we want them to do it. And so, so that's going to be important as well. Well, I want to make sure we have time to get to a couple of questions. So let me just quickly fly a couple other things by you. We need to, I think, be looking more at doing things on the subnational, regional, or state level. You know, arguably, if you could have every city, every state in the country move toward a certain policy, then it doesn't matter whether the federal government's willing to play directly on its own or not. And we have to do a better job of overall planning in these various systems. So you know, finally, keep our eye on the prize. I had the privilege of having Al Gore appear in one of my classes once, and somebody asked him, well, you know, if people politically are having a hard time talking about climate change, so shouldn't we still just instead of talk about climate change, talk about job creation and the economy? And surprisingly or not, his answer was no, we shouldn't be doing that. He said, because if we have the wrong objective in mind, we might reach the wrong conclusion. and we may do things that are not effective. And so I think we ought to be thinking about that as well. And so I'll stop there in the hopes that we might have a little time to talk about some of these things together.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one question, and I've got a burning question. I see Alice's comment there, which is a very involved question. This is a huge topic, obviously, and you've done a fantastic job trying to get our heads around a very, very big and very challenging topic. I just was wondering if you could comment, the utility commissions were established more than 100 years ago to regulate electrical monopolies. And now, with our focus on energy and the need for more electricity and electrification, are the utility commissions still able to do the job? Are they the best tool to try to achieve the objective? And in fact, we see electric prices increasing relative to gas, which disincentivizes people to adopt electric appliances and electrification of their homes.
Well, okay, so you're talking to a guy who's spent a long time in regulatory agencies and was always frustrated by them, always disappointed in them. But it's like the kid on Christmas morning who sees a pile of manure under the tree and starts digging through the manure, and parents say, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, there's got to be a pony in there somewhere." That's kind of the way I've felt about regulation. I think that the regulation by design can work, and the problem is that it becomes too much affected by the political environment in which it exists, and regulators are reticent, and again, sometimes even ashamed, to be aggressively regulating these corporations. That's the challenge, not the notion of regulation itself. So I think with effective leadership, you know, with a governor, for instance, who says, I want the regulators to be doing an aggressive job of protecting customer interests. Take, for instance, what you brought up about rates going too high. For 100 years, the pattern has been this. Utility comes in and asks for more money. The regulators then ask themselves, how much of that more money are we going to give them? And what there's never been is a time when the regulators have stepped back and said, the dynamic is wrong. We're moving in the wrong direction. So let's ask ourselves, how can we bring rates down? That doesn't happen, but regulators could take on that role and could identify a whole lot and be involved in the conversation to a much more aggressive extent. So it's not the design of regulation, it's probably the realities of how it's been rolled out and taken effect. I think that the concept we went with 100 years ago was that by and large we wanted to rely on private corporations to provide the service, and in exchange for that, you have to have economic regulation. Otherwise, you're going to get a monopoly pricing, and the prices will be too high and the supplies will be too low. So I think we have to work with that model unless we want government to take over the utilities, which is another discussion on another day.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Steve. We've got to close now, and We really appreciate your talk this morning.
Well, good. Thanks for inviting me. Take care.